Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific.
Welcome to another episode of Maritime Matters. Hey Richard, what have you been up to this week?
I've been doing quite a bit of stuff, trying to catch up on some of my historical work, and I've been really enjoying, actually, I've finally finishing up on reading Girt by Sea, which we mentioned in our podcast last week, and just a kind of a shout out, anyone, really worth a read, really interesting. Not necessarily always agreeing with everything that's written there, but really good and provocative and challenging and making me think in new kind of ways. So if you're interested in this type of thing, I'd definitely look to pick up a copy of Joanne Wallace and Beck Strating's new book.
And Beck and Joanne, you don't need to pay us for that plug. It is a great book. So what have I been up to this week? I've got a piece coming out in the Fin Review tomorrow talking about the incident with the helicopter from HMAS Hobart that we will certainly get into, and the Chinese fighter aircraft that deployed flares into it, and highlighting that as much as everybody wants to talk about the impact on the Australia-China relationship, my piece really talks about the fact that it's not an issue between Australia and China. China would like it to be dealt with as a bilateral issue, but it's a wider issue in terms of China's aggression within the region. There's incidents with many countries. Lots of countries just don't choose to publicise it.
Well, I think we ought to crack on and get on with it and start talking about what's been happening in the region. And you've already sort of prefaced probably the big issue, certainly from an Australian perspective. So do you want to outline to our listeners exactly what happened and why it is that this really matters?
On Monday, the news came out that last Saturday, on the 4th of May, HMAS Hobart conducting Operation Argos, which is enforcement of UN sanctions, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the show. The helo was up at about 7:30 that night. I don't know, but I assume doing its normal pre-sunset surface search, and a Chinese fighter aircraft came down and deployed flares. I think they said about 300 feet in front, 60 feet above, or something of that magnitude. So pretty significant. The Australian helicopter, which is obviously operating in international airspace, so has rights of overflight under Article 87, if you're a geek, of the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, had to take aversion action. So that was pretty significant. The Australian government came out and said that they had lodged a diplomatic complaint with China, and then China have come out with an explanation, and their explanation was that they were conducting a naval exercise, and the Australian helicopter was effectively spying on that naval exercise, and so they intervened. And there's a lot of reasons that scenario doesn't make a lot of sense. An Australian helicopter really viewing a naval exercise is not going to provide us too much actual useful information about naval exercises. There's plenty of other sensors that provide better information about that. But also, when you think about Australia's policy in the region, so Australia has been very clear on the fact that they don't do FONOPs, or freedom of navigation operations, which we'll also talk about later in the show. And certainly their approach is to be non-provocative, and there's a lot of evidence of that. So it would be highly surprising that there was a significant policy change that meant that HMAS Hobart, steaming by itself, would be provocative to a Chinese naval exercise. It seems a little unplausible. What was your take on the incident, Richard?
I defer to the experts in terms of the precise sort of operational side of things, but I was really interested just talking about what sort of coming off what we were talking about last week about the fact that there's been I think widely recognised as sort of a step back in terms of a lot of the dangerous incidents between American, particularly aircraft and ships, and Chinese ones in this kind of region. And that has been very notable. And obviously last week as well, Chief of Navy, it was reported, had flagged with his Chinese equivalent sort of concerns, or real concerns, about the Toowoomba incident earlier this year, last year.
No, incidentally, Toowoomba was also doing Operation Argos.
So to me, and I am I've always been slightly skeptical about some of the arguments that people are saying that this is sort of always been a really concerted Chinese campaign. And because if you look historically, often there's been a lot more influence of sort of rogue actors and sort of people acting not always to a concerted overarching campaign in these types of incidents, if you look back, for example, to the Cold War. But it does just seem extraordinary that this happens at this particular moment in time. And again, it's the focus on Australia, and other countries such as Japan have had similar kinds of pressure exerted. And so you're seeing this sort of step back from similar kind of incidents with the Americans, and I think a step up in these sorts of things with relation to countries like Australia and other American partners. So it's always very, very difficult to tell. We don't know what was going through the mind of the Chinese pilot at the particular time, or what kind of orders were given. But it does seem to fit into a wider pattern, which is obviously, you can see that within the wider frame, but it's deeply concerning from an Australian perspective. And it's this question about how the Chinese are seemingly calibrating these kind of incidents. And so that was kind of the thing that really came out to me, was this sense of it. The timing just seemed, it seemed inconceivable that this was a pure coincidence. I'm not sure.
To your point, unless you are in the Chinese C2 chain or the fighter pilot involved, it's hard to say. I do struggle with these incidents to assume that the C2 chain within the PLA is so effective that they could detect that helicopter, get the information back up through both their command and their political levels, which they have at each level of command, get approval to do something provocative, position their fighter aircraft, and do it. I just think that that is some pretty quick decision making in C2. Not to say it didn't happen, and also maybe it was a response to the reportage by Admiral Mark Hammond to the head of the Chinese Navy, but I'm not sure that they focus on us that much. I think that despite the outgoing Indo-PACOM's comments that there had been a reduction in the first quarter of this year of incidents between the PLA Air Force, and Navy and Air Force fighter jets, or Navy and Air Force aircraft from the US, there has been an increase in aggression in other areas. So not only are we seeing, as we talked about last week, increased aggression around Scarborough Shoal with the Philippines, there was an incident, I won't get into it in this show, between China and Malaysia this week. Although Malaysia doesn't take the same approach as Australia or the Philippines or the US of, this kind of assertive transparency campaign. There's been ongoing issues between Vietnam and China. So maybe it was targeted, maybe it was to send a message. But I think, as my piece in the AFR tomorrow talks about, thinking of this as an Australia-China issue is probably what China would like us to do, right? It's not a bilateral issue. It's an issue about how China views its maritime periphery as part of its territory, and how we don't view that, and other like-minded countries that are signatories to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and those that aren't, including the US, view that the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is actually what dictates access, sovereignty, and resources over maritime zones. So maybe, but maybe not.
So elsewhere in the region, I think we've seen some sort of interesting developments in terms of the wrapping up, or the sort of the finale, as it were, of exercise Balikatan. Primarily, of course, a US-Philippine sort of exercise, but into which a number of other countries, including Australia, contributed forces. And so, as often with these exercises, they kind of step up in intensity as it goes along. And so we've seen the real kind of sort of high-intensity elements playing out over the past week, which has included the ubiquitous SYNCEX, which we always have to have as part of these exercises. Some potentially interesting commentary around that, at least in the regard that the target chosen was a Chinese-built vessel, which was the only Chinese-built vessel which had been in service with the Philippines Navy. Everyone else is the official spokespeople, of course, say this is entirely coincidental, and I'm sure in reality it probably is, but it's something that got picked up as perhaps there's an element of signalling going on there. It was targeted by a wide range of different munitions from a range of different sources. In fact, the RAAF E7 Wedgetail was part of that, providing a lot of the targeting data. One of the things that was quite interesting was that the Philippine flagship frigate, the Jose Rizal, which is a Korean-made, relatively new frigate, and she fired a anti-ship missile, a Korean Sea Star anti-ship missile, as one of the sort of the key elements of that kind of exercise. So this is part of the growing capability, I think, of the Philippines Armed Forces, which is I think sort of a really notable element within our region. And again, also I think it's quite interesting the changes in terms of who is supplying these type of high-level bits of kit to whom. So this is again Korean export to the Philippines. Beyond that, there were also some quite notable exercises involving US Marines, I think primarily, and Philippine Army forces, which were sort of live fire counter landing exercises. So again, exactly the sort of thing that you would expect to see as part of this exercise, but quite clearly, given the current environment, it's notable that these things are taking place and are receiving quite a lot of coverage, and certainly the militaries are making it quite clear what it is that they are doing. So important exercise, and I think it's good to see sort of Australian involvement and the growing kind of capabilities in the Philippines.
I agree with you. I think for those watching, if you haven't seen the footage, worthwhile checking out the footage of that SYNC-X. I think it is symbolic in a lot of ways. It does demonstrate how regional capabilities are evolving, and certainly how the Philippines military is evolving, and also stuff about Korea's ability to export ships into the region, which is becoming an increasing trend as well. Another thing I thought was interesting this week is the US released their 2023 report on their Freedom of Navigation program. So when people think about FONOPS, they often think about the US transiting their ships. So FONOPS, Freedom of Navigation Operations, which is a US term. It is a term that I deeply despise. I'm just going to put that out there. For me, freedom of navigation is a thing under Article 87 of the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. It's not an operation, and I think that when you make it an operation, it makes it sound like you are doing something aggressive or provocative. When it's just international law, ships have the right to operate where they wish, with certain restrictions if you're in a territorial water or an archipelagic sea lane. But anyway, they released their report. They said that they had done 29 different excessive maritime claims. So they had challenged 29 different excessive maritime claims against 17 different claimants throughout the world. So again, people think of FONOPS as something that happens in the Spratlys to send a message to China, but it is much a wider program. And in fact, it's actually been going on since 1979, which I think is interesting. There's two elements to it, right? There's the operations where they sail and fly ships through certain places to prove a point. But there is also the diplomatic element where they conduct a number of kind of reportages diplomatically about some of these claims. And although the US did not have a freedom of navigation operational challenge in Australia, there are certain claims that Australia has that the US doesn't agree with. particularly in the Great Australian Bight and how we draw our baselines, but they don't bother to sail a ship down there. We'd probably point out that they're not a signatory to the Convention of the Law of the Sea. But some of the countries that they did allegedly conduct freedom of navigation challenges include Cambodia, Colombia, Croatia, which is interesting, China, of course, Iran, Japan is listed, Latvia, the Maldives, Malta, Oman, Russia, Taiwan, Thailand, Vietnam, Yemen, and the UAE. So it is a pretty extensive program they've conducted in 2023. In terms of China, they've highlighted that their FONOPs were aimed at the following claims, which include China's straight baseline claims that they say don't conform with international law, the fact that China requires prior approval for military survey activities in an inclusive economic zone, which again, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea doesn't require that. The fact that China has restrictions on foreign aircraft flying through their so-called air defense identification zone without the intent to enter national airspace. So their ADIS goes well beyond national airspace. Now, China is, of course, not the only country. Plenty of countries have that, but the US has obviously been challenging that. They also challenge the fact that, China tends to say that they require permission for innocent passage of foreign military ships through a territorial sea, which again is not in accordance with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So look, interesting report. I think it's an interesting process that the US do these freedom of navigation challenges and then write a very detailed report on it once a year, which you can find it on their website. So what else has taken you by interest this week, Richard?
So the other big bit of news that's really grabbed my attention this week is in the kind of capability area, and that is the strikes that took place at ASC. ASC is the organisation, the company that originally built the Collins-class submarines and now is the sort of the leading maintainer of Collins and operate primarily out of Osborne Shipyard in South Australia. ASC also has workers in Western Australia at Henderson. And there was a big strike on Monday so this is a program of strikes, the first of which took place on Monday. It's being led by the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, and the union has claimed that the workers in South Australia are being paid effectively 17% less than their colleagues in Western Australia. And this is despite the fact that the workers in South Australia are currently in the process of having to train up their Western Australian counterparts, because most of the deep maintenance is what happens in South Australia at Osborne, and that is where the kind of core skills-based and knowledge base is. And yet, despite this, the South Australian workers apparently being paid less than their colleagues. So this is a potentially a significant issue. As I say, there's a series of strikes. The company has come back and issued a statement which basically acknowledges that this is taking place and challenges certain elements of what the union has said. But it's clear at the moment that there is, it doesn't seem there's an immediate end to this. And I think this is really important for a number of reasons. The first of which is that Osborne is currently really ramping up ASC at Osborne to undertake the Collins LOTE, so the life of type extension of the Collins-class submarines. This has been the element of the kind of the big AUKUS optimal pathway which has received the least attention, and in many ways I think is the one that people should really be focusing on, certainly in the short term, because it is a huge endeavour, and it is one that we cannot get wrong. And it is one in which there is quite a lot of sort of time frame pressure as well. So the idea that there is a sort of industrial disputes and industrial issues could cause significant issues within this. So I think in that regard, it's definitely worth keeping an eye on. But I think there's a much bigger picture here. There's a good reason why workers in Western Australia are paid more. It's because the shipyards in Western Australia are desperately trying to hold on and often failing to hold on to their workers in the face of competition from the resources industry, which can pay that kind of skilled labour much higher. And in fact, the managing director of BAE, Craig Lockhart, made some very blunt comments only a few months ago about the challenge of maintaining workers in Western Australia and the degree to which, in fact, the yards in South Australia are struggling from the drain of resources west. So all of this is going to be a huge challenge. Do you try and pay workers in South Australia the same as workers in Western Australia, despite the very different kind of economic situations there? The fundamental problem is we don't actually have enough skilled workers to be doing all the things that we need to be doing, and that's now. And if you look at how the programs are going to ramp up over the next few years, and they're going to ramp up very, very quickly, the challenge of upskilling and building that workforce sufficiently to be able to maintain it and do so in the face of things like challenges from the resources industry is going to be hugely problematic. So I think this is a story which will probably be a slow burn, but is one that definitely is worth keeping an eye on. What were your sort of takes, Jen?
A lot of people said for quite a while that workforce is the biggest risk to the planned expansion of the surface combatant fleet, but also, the AUKUS optimal submarine plan. And so this kind of just exposes some of the vulnerabilities. And for me, it kind of highlights, the concept of maritime power as a national enterprise, right? And maybe because I was just speaking to Professor Jeff Till, if you're a fan of maritime strategy, you would have heard of Jeff Till. Released a book in 2023, which was the winner of the Australian Naval Institute's Sam Bateman Book Prize. There's a plug, called How to Grow a Navy, right? And it talks about the fact that one of the reasons that China has been so successful in rapidly growing its navy is that it's very much viewed maritime power as a national enterprise. And so that's where sometimes Australia struggles, and this is one of the things that prompted, Tim Barrett to write his book, Navy in the Nation, all those years ago, is that we don't necessarily look at it that way. So I think, it's interesting. It's potentially a sign of things to come in terms of some of those workforce challenges that people have highlighted. And it is probably more important than people have really given it credit for in terms of the risk to Australia's future naval power, but also what it says about Australia as a maritime nation would be my initial thoughts.
Yeah, it's certainly something to be keeping an eye on. What else has caught your eye in terms of capability this week?
There's been a few things. Obviously, just quickly, we've seen the expansion of the wharf at HMAS Coonawarra. So HMAS Coonawarra is in Darwin. Previously, you could only ever berth a patrol boat, realistically, or maybe a survey motor launch in Coonawarra. So there's been a lot of work going there for a very long time to expand Coonawarra, and we saw that one of the LHDs, can't remember whether it was Adelaide or Canberra, I should know, I think it was Adelaide, coming alongside Kourou Wharf. So, Adelaide being a 28,000-tonne vessel, it's pretty significant in terms of the dramatic change between a base that you could only get a patrol boat into to a base that you can bring an LHD alongside. What were your thoughts on that?
Oh, I just absolutely big change, long-running kind of project, and big money involved in trying to do these kinds of projects, particularly in the Northern Territory. But I think it also, if you look, when we talked about the NDS, for example, this fits quite clearly into that sense of trying to build up the infrastructure and the basing and support infrastructure in Northern Australia in order to facilitate a slightly different kind of ADF force posture. And also, Darwin is not only sort of ADF focused, there's also potential of sort of our American colleagues and compatriots exploiting similar kind of resources. So I think it clearly is an element of a much bigger story, really important in and of itself. But I think, again, this is one of those things to be just keeping an eye on and seeing how, hopefully, we'll be seeing a lot more of these kinds of stories playing out. But yeah, whether or not we do, I suspect depends a lot on precisely how much it costs to get concrete and steel and dredges and everything else up into the Northern Territory, which is exorbitantly expensive, as everyone keeps on pointing out.
It's good to see that a lot of trend about increasing northern defence infrastructure. It wasn't new in the NDS or the DSR. It was also a focal point in the FSP, and in fact, the Force Structure Review, I think it was Force Posture Review, conducted in about 2013, 2014, something like that, also talked about this being a priority. So it's been something that's been apparently a priority for a long time. But it's good to see the maritime flavour in it, because a lot of people think about, well, it's about reinforcing the air bases in the north, which it is, but it's also about supporting Army, maritime, and space capabilities up there. So
yep,
quite
absolutely.
important.
My one element of cynicism is exactly what you've just said, that we've been hearing about a lot of this for a very long time, and whether or not we see that manifest in physical form is always where my skepticism comes out. Has anything else caught your attention? Your drone watch, has that been flagging this week?
Right, there's been a couple of things in drones this week. There has been some interesting reporting of, in fact, China's extra-large UUV program. HI Sutton, which a good cross, whatever it's called. When I plug another podcast, The Saltwater Strategist, I did an interview with HI Sutton recently. HI Sutton is the drone expert when you think about sea drones. So check out his website if you haven't seen it. He didn't pay me for that. But he's actually just produced something talking about China's extra-large UUV, uncrewed underwater vessel program. So we've talked about this a little bit in terms of Australia's Ghost Shark program, the US's Orca program, Japan has a program, India has a program, everybody has a program. But it's been quite difficult to ascertain what China is doing in this space. We know that they are doing a lot. They have a significant number of prototypes, but they're not necessarily so transparent in it. So there was a Defence Service Asia exhibition and conference in Malaysia this week, and a Chinese company called Polytechnology actually revealed a UUV 300. Which is a pretty impressive extra large looking UUV. And what's significant about it is because they said, at least, that they intended for it to be armed, which, look, certainly a lot of countries are pursuing that, but they're not necessarily talking about that. You know, they say payloads to be confirmed. And they also talked about it potentially becoming an export version. So that's what they were plugging at this show. Now, in terms of the vessel, it's about 11.5 meters in length, so it's pretty big. About 50 tons. They say it can operate to about 300 meters. They say it has a range of 450 nautical miles. I don't know, maybe. And a speed of about 5 knots. So, look, I think it's interesting in terms of the fact that it's been openly put out there and showed for potential export. And it also shows that, you know, China, despite the fact that we don't see a lot of press releases from them on this capability, is well ahead. And, you know, HI Sutton's assessment is that they are probably the most advanced in uncrewed underwater vehicles. Maybe not so much in the technology, because that's hard to assess, but certainly in terms of the quantity of prototypes they are exercising. So I thought that was fairly interesting. The other thing that was interesting, if you're keeping an eye on what's happening in Ukraine and the Black Sea, and here's another shameless plug. The Australian Naval Review will be coming out in June, which has a piece from me looking at what's happening in the Black Sea with USVs. We did see some interesting footage online of a modified Ukrainian USV with surface-to-air missiles, so the Russian R-73 surface-to-air missile, and an interaction with a Russian aircraft. So we know that Ukraine have been using uncrewed surface vessels of different types, generally remotely controlled, quite successfully. They have sunk a number of ships, and there was another attack in the last week where they reportedly sunk a patrol ship whilst in port. So we know that this has been pretty successful. But we also know that those drones are quite vulnerable from the air, and there has been footage that's popped up over the last 12 months of helicopters destroying them with small to medium caliber arms. So I guess this footage of the surface-to-air missile armed drone is about how you counter that threat from Russian helicopters. Now, in the footage that's online, unfortunately, the drone was destroyed by the Russian helicopter, but it certainly changes the dynamic and gives Russia something else to think about. So I think in terms of the evolution of drone warfare, I think that's quite interesting. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really interesting development, because if you look at how even Western navies have looked to respond to fast inshore attack craft, whether they be crewed or uncrewed, actually airborne assets are often seen as sort of some of the most effective, and that's played out from what we know in the Red Sea. The Germans have had quite a lot of success with that. The Americans also had a lot of success with that. A number of things, even down to some of the Anglo-French sort of weapons development, has been focused on looking at arming some of the lighter helicopters in order to fulfill this role. So anything that can then pose a challenge in that kind of space suddenly makes that far more difficult. Begins to add that tension into what was previously a kind of a one-directional competition. So not hugely surprising in terms of the longer-term development, but as often with what's happening in the Ukraine, what's really surprising is how quickly they're managing to get these evolutions out there. It would have been something we would have expected, but certainly I did not expect it to happen as anything like as quickly as they've managed. So, yeah, really interesting, and plays into this sort of constantly changing dynamic between surface combatants and crewed combatants, and this sort of developing USV technology. So this week, we thought we'd go with a relatively relevant Did You Know, building off the sort of headline story we've had this week about the Chinese interception of the Australian helicopter. So Jen's going to briefly outline Operation Argos.
So I guess some of the amusing responses to China's what is aggressive but also illegal activity, and it really does put the women and men of the Australian Defence Force at risk. And as I said earlier in the show, we shouldn't downplay the fact that we are very lucky that there hasn't been loss of life in some of these incidents, right? So some of the criticism of Australia has been, well, why is Australia operating in the Yellow Sea? It would be better to defend Australia in Australia's own backyards. Well, Australia's not operating in the Yellow Sea to defend Australia per se. We've been conducting Operation Argos. And Operation Argos, if you go into the headquarters JOC website, you can actually find a description of that. Is an operation to enforce UN sanctions on North Korea. So the UN Security Council in 2006 actually developed sanctions against North Korea following their nuclear missile test. And interestingly, at the time, John Howard was our Prime Minister, and Australia was probably one of the first countries that came out and said, we will probably send military assets to enforce these sanctions. Now, obviously, there are the UN sanctions. Australia does have its own sanctions on North Korea as well. That's not what Operation Argos is predominantly looking at. But from 2018, Australia has significantly ramped up its support to enforcing UN sanctions on North Korea. And that's the import of a number of banned goods and also the export of a significant number of banned goods. So in February 24, the Australian Department of Defence said that on 13 occasions they have deployed maritime patrol aircraft to support Operation Argos. In fact, we had a MPRA, so a P-8, operating out of Japan earlier this year, supporting that operation, and 10 Navy vessels. Now, that's probably 11 with HMAS Hobart up there. But it has been an operation we've been conducting for some time to support those UN sanctions. And predominantly, we're looking for ships conducting illegal transfers at sea of the banned exports or imports. So it is a pretty important operation that Australia does. And it does explain why Australia is operating in the Yellow Sea. Not to mention, it is international waters and the concept of freedom of navigation and freedom of overflight. But that is Operation Argos.
Excellent. Thanks for clearing that up. And hopefully, well, I'm not sure how many of our listeners are likely to be those who are questioning what on earth Australia is doing up there. But hopefully, if you are wondering quite why it is that an Australian warship is operating quite so far north, that is why. It's part of a internationally approved, UN-approved operation.
Well, thanks, Richard. It's been another great episode of Maritime Matters. I would just ask our listeners, if you like the show, then please subscribe or share it on whatever platform you listen to it to. And if you've got a recommendation for our Did You Know segment, then please feel free to put it in the comments of YouTube. Or if you know Richard or I personally, drop us a text. Have a great weekend, Richard.
You too, Jen. Cheers.
Thanks.